Welcome to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This lecture is intended for students enrolled in the Academy's Philosophy 311 Classical Ethics course. If you're not enrolled and would like to join us for self-paced studies, please visit classicalliberalarts.com. My name is William Michael. I'm the Academy headmaster, and I'll be leading this study. Before we begin, let's commit this time of study to God and ask for strength to study well. Let us pray. Lord our God, in your wisdom and love, you surround us with the mysteries of the universe. Send your Spirit upon us and fill us with your wisdom and blessings. Grant that we may devote ourselves to our studies and draw ever closer to you, the source of all knowledge. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our lesson today comes from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1 and Chapter 7. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher who lived from 384 to 322 BC and wrote the Nicomachean Ethics as a systematic study or a philosophical investigation of human virtue and happiness. This particular chapter, Chapter 7, represents one of the most important passages in all of Western philosophy because it defines what human happiness truly is and how we can achieve it. In this chapter, Aristotle returns from his discussion of whether a universal good or a form of the good exists. We dealt with that in Chapter 6. He now returns to the topic that he was discussing before Chapter 6, which is the question of human good or happiness, what we should aim for in life. He argues that just as different arts and crafts have different goals or purposes, for example, medicine aims at health, military strategy aims at victory, building aims at the creation of a house, so human life must also have a specific goal or end, and Aristotle calls this end happiness. This idea of happiness means to live well as a human being, to fulfill the purpose of human life. That's human happiness. However, as we saw in previous chapters, there's disagreement about what exactly human happiness consists of. There are different opinions of what happiness consists of. So we want to investigate philosophically, in light of the truth of human nature, what human happiness in its most perfect form would consist of. That's the goal. Aristotle wrote this work on Nicomachean Ethics in order to teach people how to live virtuously and achieve true happiness. He argued that the goal in this study is not to know what's good, but to actually be good, and that by means of being good, we will obtain true human happiness. This chapter, Chapter 7, is crucial in this study because it moves from discussing happiness in general to explaining precisely what happiness is and how we can recognize it. Aristotle does this by examining the unique function or work of human beings. What makes us distinctly human and what we are meant to do. So we're going to root the idea of human happiness in a true understanding of human nature and human potential. This chapter serves as the foundation for everything that's going to follow in our study of Aristotle's Ethics. Once he establishes what happiness is, and that it comes through the exercise of virtue, the rest of this book is going to explain what the individual virtues are and how we can develop them. Without understanding the content of chapter 7, we cannot understand Aristotle's ethical system that follows in this book. It's important to remember as we get into this that Aristotle's teaching in this chapter, and remember, this was written 322 years before Christ, at least 322 years before the foundation of the Christian church. Aristotle's teaching in this chapter has had a profound influence on Catholic theology and scholastic philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval Christian philosopher and theologian, built his entire moral theology on the Aristotelian principles that we study and learn beginning in this chapter. The Catholic Church teaches that human happiness comes through living virtuously according to reason, which is exactly what Aristotle argues here in this book. This chapter remains central to how Catholics understand or should understand human happiness and the moral life. So the importance of this chapter really can't be overstated. It's fundamental to a Christian understanding of morals and happiness. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to stop here and say that you should have already made your own first reading of the text. We always want to keep focused on the primary texts that we're studying and get as close as we can to the originals. So if you haven't yet made a first reading of chapter 7 of book 1 of Aristotle's Ethics, I'd like to ask you to stop this lecture and go and do that now. If you've already made your first reading, we can continue and get into the division of chapter 7. So let's continue, but if you haven't read yet, pause this lecture, go do your first reading, and then come back and pick up where you left off. Now, looking at chapter 7, we can divide the chapter into, 7 significant parts. We're going to divide chapter 7 into 7 significant parts to give us a sense of the structure of this chapter. The first part of this lesson has to do with the good as the end of each art and action. The good, and you can put that in quotes, as the end of each art and action. The second part deals with the perfect end, the perfect human end and happiness, the perfect end and happiness. And this begins where we read, "Because, therefore, it appears that there are many ends, and of these we choose some on account of others." So where we read, "Because, therefore, it appears that there are many ends," this marks the beginning of the second part of this chapter on the perfect end and happiness. The third part deals with happiness as a self-sufficient good. Happiness as a self-sufficient good. This begins where we read, "The same thing also appears to happen from that which enables a man to be sufficient to himself." The same thing also appears. That's the beginning of part 3. Part 4 deals with the function of man, or the purpose of man. This begins where we read, "Perhaps, however, to say that happiness is the best of things is to assert that which is acknowledged by all men. So where we read, perhaps, however, to say that happiness, where we read that, that's the beginning of Part 4, the function of man. Part 5 deals with identifying the human function. Identifying the human function. This begins where we read, whether, therefore, are there certain works and actions, indeed, of a carpenter and a shoemaker? Whether, therefore, are there certain works, begins Part 5. Part 6 deals with happiness as virtuous activity. Happiness as virtuous activity. We read, but if the work of man is the energy of soul according to reason. That marks the beginning of Part 6. And lastly, Part 7 deals with the nature of definition and methodology. So we get more generally philosophical for a moment at the end of Chapter 7, dealing with the nature of definition and methodology. We read, let this therefore be a description of the good, for it is necessary perhaps as in a picture, and so on. Let this therefore be a description of the good, the beginning of the final part of this chapter. So we divide the chapter into 7 significant parts, and having done so, let's get started with the real work, which is the interpretation of Chapter 7. So we open Chapter 7 reading Aristotle, and he says, now, however, let us return to the investigated good and show what it is. So remember that Chapter 6 was sort of a diversion where Aristotle thoroughly demolished Platonic philosophy. He explained why Platonic philosophy, the theory of forms, the idea of a universal good, all of that is logically impossible, and he demolishes Platonism in Chapter 6. But that was really just to clear the path for the establishment of his moral philosophy, which he picks up here in Chapter 7. So again, he says, let us return. Let's get back to our real subject here, the investigated good. That is, the good that we're investigating in this text, and show what it is. Let's get to it. He reminds us that we've been investigating in the previous chapters what this good is, what human good is. And he now promises that he's going to show us what it is. We're going to get right to it. It's important to learn from Aristotle here a good lesson on essay writing. We often like to keep our thesis secret and sort of hold on to it and reveal it in the end or in the midst of our writing. But we see that that's really not good practice. Aristotle gets right to his thesis. He's going to get right to it and announce to us what human happiness consists in, and then he's going to spend the rest of this book proving his thesis. And that provides us with a good model for essay writing. We should be confident in our thesis, make it known to our reader right up front, and invite our reader then to reflect on that thesis and put it to the test, examine it, and see if it's true by the arguments that we then provide. So we see Aristotle here putting his thesis right up front for us to examine. He's going to tell us what that good is, and then prove it to us through the rest of this book. He goes on to write, quote, "For it appears that there is a different good in a different action and art. And since there is one good in the medical art, another in the art of commanding an army, and in a similar manner in the remaining arts." So Aristotle, again, speaking from observation, this is simple common knowledge. Remember, he's starting the learning process with our common knowledge, common sense, as it were. If we look around, we see lots of different arts and sciences or arts being practiced. We see physicians practicing a medical art or different theories of that medical art. We see carpenters performing their own art. We see leaders of the military performing their own art. And it's very clear, just by simple observation, that they have different activities and goals. They're doing different things. They're thinking about different things. They have different purposes, different ends, and so on. Different activities have different goals, different ends. Medicine is the art of healing. The goal of medicine is health. Military strategy is the art of commanding armies, and the goal of that commanding is victory in war. Building is the art of constructing, and the goal is building a completed house. Each art, and there are countless arts and different activities, each of them has its own specific end or purpose. It's actually these differences in purpose that are the cause of these different arts. They all have different ends or purposes, and that's a crucial observation. And again, just a common sense observation, because it shows us that these goals are not random or arbitrary, but they're built into the nature of each activity. Each of these activities exists for the sake of these different ends, and we can see that by simple observation. Why is this important? Why is this important? Aristotle is establishing, as he mentioned in the opening chapter of this book, that purposefulness is fundamental to human activity. Remember, the opening of this book was that every human action, every deliberate choice, and so on, seems to aim at some certain good. So he's showing us that willful or intentional human activity is always goal-oriented. It's always aimed at some end. It's always purposeful. Human beings don't act randomly. Human beings don't act randomly. Every action we perform, and again, that's with intention. Every action that we perform, that's willful and intentional, not some random activity or thoughtless activity. But every intentional activity that we perform is purposeful. It's directed toward some end. And when we understand this, it helps us to see that human life in general, as a whole, human life must also be directed toward some ultimate end. It would make no sense for us to see this habit, this human habit of purposefulness in every activity, and then not believe that there is some ultimate purpose for the human race. So investigating this ultimate purpose, what are all of these different arts, all of these different activities, what are they all contributing to? What is the overall good or end to which all of them are being directed? That's what we want to understand here. And Aristotle asks this question, quote, "What therefore is the good in each? What therefore is the good in each? Is it not that for the sake of which other things are affected by that art? Is the good not that for the sake of which other things are affected by that art?" So he asks, what is the good of each of these human arts? And his answer is that the good is that for the sake of which other things are done. The good is that for the sake of which other things are done. So, for example, in medicine, what's the goal of that art? Doctors perform all kinds of different actions. They examine patients, they prescribe remedies, they perform surgeries, on and on, all kinds of activities. What's the goal? The goal is health. Health is the end of all of those activities. There is one good that's sought through the medical art. Health is that end, and all medical actions are directed or aimed at affecting that end. That's what Aristotle means when he says that for the sake of which other things are affected. The end that's pursued is the reason why we do those other things. So we can see that habit in human activity. This introduces a fundamental principle in Aristotelian philosophy, and this is the principle of final causality. Final causality. That may sound impressive, but it's really very simple. What we see here is the principle of final causality. Everything that happens has a purpose or an end. And remember, this word final, it means the end. The final cause is the purpose for which something is done, or the purpose for which something happens. It is a cause, and it's final in the sense that it is directed at an end. The idea of final here refers to the end or the goal at which the activity is directed. So this concept or this principle of final causality, very fundamental in Aristotelian philosophy, as we'll see. And I want to also say about this idea of the final cause in things, that this is one of Aristotle's principles that is rejected in modern society. In secular education, in secular politics, in secular sciences, you'll notice that the question of final cause is not discussed. It's considered to be something that can't be known, or it's even denied to exist, that there is some final cause in things. And you'll see that this is really the foundation of the controversies in modern society. For example, if we take a concept like, or a controversy like gay marriage, we'll see that Christians will argue that marriage is for a man and a woman, and the end of marriage, the final cause that directs marriage, is reproduction. So we'll see that the Christians are arguing from a view of the final cause, whereas in democratic secular society, they'll try to argue that there really is no final cause. There's no such thing. Anyone who wants to get married can get married, and they can get married for whatever purpose they want. There is no actual final cause. The same thing is true with abortion or contraception. Christians will talk about the final cause of these activities. They'll say that sexual activity, the final cause, is reproduction, and therefore contraception is contrary to nature, and it's evil. The argument coming from secular society will be that there is no such thing as a final cause. There is no such thing as an actual ultimate purpose. There is no such thing as design. It's just all random, and we're free to do with it whatever we want. The argument is literally, my body, my choice. There is no final cause. This body of mine is for me to do anything I want with. So we see that this principle in Aristotle's philosophy, this principle of final causality, is something that marks Aristotelian philosophy and distinguishes it from what we experience in modern society. If you feel like modern society is crazy, this is the reason why. It denies that there is any such thing as final causality. So we'll keep an eye on this principle as we go through these studies. Aristotle, on the other hand, a breath of fresh air and some reason, argues that everything happens for a purpose or end. And he doesn't just say that like modern people do. Oh, I believe that everything happens for... No, we need to know what that purpose is. That's the whole point of saying that. We want to know what that purpose is. It's not just everything happens for some unknown purpose. That's not helpful. We want to know what that purpose or what that end actually is. We want to know the order of these things. We want to order our own will. We want to be wise and good. We want to know the end that we can aim our lives at and aim all of our actions at so that we can live well. Aristotle believes that there is such an end. Everything has a purpose. Every human action, regardless of what someone says, has a purpose or end, has a final cause. When we understand the end, then we can understand why things are being done. A doctor's actions make sense only when we understand that he is working to bring about health, that health is the final cause of his activities. When we understand the end he's seeking, we can then look at and understand the activities that he's undertaking. So we want to know the final cause of things that we observe. We want to know the final cause to understand why things are as they are. Remember, we believe that we know a thing, or we truly know a thing, when we know its causes. Final cause is one of those causes. Aristotle goes on and says, quote, "But in the medical art, it is indeed health. In the art of commanding an army, it is victory. In the art of building a house, it is the house. And it's something else in another art." So he gives some specific examples just for the sake of illustration. In medicine, the end is health. In military arts, the end is victory. In building, the end is a completed house. Each art has its own specific end. And these examples show us just how diverse these ends are. It's quite funny to think about. The military commander is trying to blow up buildings and kill people to win a battle. The physician is trying to heal people. The builder is trying to construct houses. It seems that these activities are almost at odds with one another. This shows us the great breadth in the diversity of ends in different activities. So I think we could argue that Aristotle chooses these examples for this reason. It shows us just how broad and diverse these ends are in human actions. He goes on to say, "In every action and in every deliberate choice, it is the end, since all of them perform other things for the sake of this. In every action and deliberate choice, it is the end, since all of them perform other things for the sake of this." And you'll recognize that this is the language that opens chapter 1 of this book. In the very first chapter, we talked about how every human action, every deliberate choice has some good as its end. You notice that we've come back to that same topic here in chapter 7. Aristotle extends this principle of final causality. He extends this idea to all human actions, not just arts, not just these formal arts that we can observe and see at work, but he extends this to all human actions. all deliberate choices. Just to clarify this phrase, deliberate choice. What he means by deliberate choice is a choice that we make after deliberation. So it's an intentional choice. If you think about the idea in Catholic theology, if you think about the idea of mortal sin, we say that a sin is mortal when it has to do with some grave moral matter, like killing someone. But it also has to be done with understanding, and it has to be done with intention. You see that idea of intentional action. That's what Aristotle's referring to when he talks about deliberate choice. So we make decisions at times that are not deliberate choices. We may make a choice in a split second because we react to something. Like the other day I was walking and I almost stepped on a snake on our back walking trail. And I immediately shouted because I was surprised to see the snake there. And I sort of awkwardly jumped over it. That wasn't a deliberate choice. That was just a reaction. Another example of an activity that would not be a deliberate choice would be a choice that someone makes when they're being threatened. So if someone put a gun to my head and told me to do something, and I did it out of fear, not thinking, that would not be a deliberate choice. So when he talks about deliberate choice, he means human choices that are made after deliberation. So every human action, every intentional, purposeful human action, every deliberate choice has some end in view. All of them perform things for the sake of this end. So he extends this principle to all human actions, all deliberate choices. In every action that we choose to perform, there is an end. We perform other things for the sake of these ends. So if we were to study our lives and take notes on all the things that we do, all the intentional actions that we take, all the deliberate choices we make, and if we were to monitor them all, track them all, take notes on everything we're doing, we would be able to recognize patterns that reveal what ultimate end we're seeking. We could look, for example, at our bank account and see what we're buying, what we're spending money on, and we would see that there are certain ends that are being sought by our financial decisions. We can look at our daily schedule and look and see how we're using time, what our schedule shows us as to what we're pursuing in life, what are our priorities, what are the important things that we're working toward. All of our actions and decisions can be shown to be aimed at certain ends. And the goal in the study of ethics is to examine whether or not our actions and choices in our whole life is being directed at the proper end for a human life. That's going to be the goal of this study, to examine our lives, to learn what the proper end of a human life is, and then to ask whether our life and all of our actions, all of our choices are being directed toward that end, the proper and true end of a human life. So in every action we choose to perform, there's some end, and we perform all things for the sake of this end. When we study, we don't study for the sake of studying. We study in order to learn something, and we're seeking to learn something not necessarily as an end in itself, but for the sake of something else. And there's this whole chain, this whole hierarchy of ends that is pursued through our different actions. When we exercise in the same way, we exercise not because we just want to exercise for its own sake, but we want to be healthy, we want to be strong, we want to avoid sickness, we want to avoid disease, we don't want to be injured, and so on. We exercise for the sake of a purpose. Every deliberate action that we perform has an end that explains why we do it. Every deliberate action has a final cause. As I mentioned before, this phrase deliberate choice is important. We'll see it not only here in ethics, but we'll also talk about it a lot in rhetoric. This idea of deliberate choice. These are actions that we consciously choose. They're not just instinctive reactions. For example, cows will make choices. If I go out to the field and call to the cattle, they'll start walking toward me. They don't do that after deliberation. They don't start having a council together, talking about their options and decide what they're going to do. They instinctively come to me because I give them their food and water. So they come. Jesus says, the sheep hear their shepherd's voice. That's by instinct. It's not by deliberate choice. But in human activity, because we possess the faculty of reason, we're able to act differently. We're able to deliberate and think of actions and take actions for the sake of ends that are not immediately in front of us. And so this concept of the purposefulness of human activity, but the fact that it can also be complex. It's not simple like that of a dog or a cat or some cattle out in the field. Human actions can have complex ends, and they can be served by indirect activities. So we may be doing something that's done for the sake of something else, which is done for the sake of something else, which is done for the sake of something else, which ultimately is done for the sake of a chief end in our life. And we want to know whether or not the chief end of our life is what it should be. And we want to correct that. We want to make the correct chief end, the chief end in our life, and then reorder all things in our life so that everything is aligned with that chief end. So this ability to have deliberate choice, this intentionality in human activity, shows that human beings are rational. We act for reasons directed toward ends that we choose by means of reasoning. Aristotle goes on and says, hence, if there is one certain end of all actions, this will be the practical good. If there is one certain end of all actions, this will be the practical good. But if there are many ends, then these will be the practical goods. So Aristotle here draws a really important conclusion. If all human actions are directed towards ends, and we know that they are, we've already established that by simple observation, we can see that. If all human actions are directed toward ends, then there's either one single end that all actions ultimately aim at, or there are many different ends. And if there is one ultimate end, that would be the practical good, the highest good in the practical order or the order of human action. If there is one ultimate end, that would be the practical good. But if there are many different ends, and just so you know, in Aristotelian philosophy, when he uses the word many, he means more than one. So think of, in grammar, we learn the plural number. We have singular and plural. Plural just means more than one. That's what Aristotle means when he says many. So don't think when he says many, he means 1,000. More than one is many. One, you see the comparison here, whether the end is one or many, singular or plural. So understand the use of many in Aristotle's texts. I think that's helpful. If there are many ends or more than one end, then we would have a plurality of practical goods. This is a pivotal moment in Aristotle's argument here. He's suggesting that human life, and he hasn't proven this yet, he's simply investigating this. He's leading us through this process of learning, right? Everything that he's saying is based on common observation. This is just common sense. But he's showing us that we have a really important question to answer. And that question is it possible or is it true that human life has a single ultimate purpose? We can see all these different purposes in all these different activities. That's just common sense. But if we examine this, if we look into this scientifically or philosophically, is it true that all of these ends have some ultimate end, some chief end that they're all directed toward, or that they should all be directed toward? So notice how Aristotle moves from common observations, which don't really tell us much of anything, to this important philosophical problem or question. How many ends are there? Is it possible that there's just one ultimate end? Obviously, we're going to need to find an answer to that question because it's the ultimate question. Is there one ultimate end? If we can see that all human actions are directed towards different ends, is it possible that there is one ultimate human end? Aristotle is suggesting that human life might have a single ultimate purpose or a final end to which all of our actions are to be directed. And this is the question that he's going to investigate here as we continue in chapter 7. He says this, quote, "The reasoning in its transition arrives at the same thing as was asserted by us in the beginning. We must endeavor to render this still more clear." So he says, I've already hinted at this before. I've already talked about this, but we need to prove this. He acknowledges that while he has already established the basic principle, that it needs to be proven, it needs to be made clear, more precise. And that's going to be his task for the rest of this chapter. He's already suggested that there is an ultimate end. It's time to get serious about this and prove it, to explain it clearly and provide the evidence or the arguments that make it necessary for us to accept this teaching. And that moves us into part 2, where we investigate this perfect end and happiness. He says, quote, "Because, therefore, it appears that there are many ends, and of these we choose some on account of others, such as wealth or flutes, and in short, instruments, things that we use. It's evident that all ends, all of the different ends that are pursued in different activities, it's evident that they are not perfect. Many of these ends are not perfect," he says. It's clear that many activities are instrumental. We pursue them as means to something else. So there's a difference. There are different kinds of activities. Some seem to be ends in themselves. Some seem to be instruments that are done for the sake of something else. We want money, for example, because we want to do things with that money. We take a flute because we want to produce music, and we want to produce music because we want to relax our minds and have some refreshment. So we see that there are actions done for their own sake and actions done for the sake of something else. There are different kinds of ends. Not all ends are perfect. So he observes here that we already know that there are many different ends or goals. Some of these ends are chosen for the sake of other ends, and he gives examples. We want wealth for the sake of other things it can obtain for us. We understand that these are instrumental ends, as I said. Because these ends are chosen for the sake of something else, they're not perfect ends. An end that's chosen only as a means to something else is imperfect, and by imperfect he means not complete. An end chosen as a means to something else points beyond itself to something else as its further purpose. So an instrumental action says to us that there's something else that's more important. And it directs our attention to that next thing. What is that next thing? If we're working for wealth, and wealth is not pursued for its own sake, that draws our attention to that next end to ask, well, what is that wealth desired for? We want to know that higher or more perfect end for which the wealth is sought. So that's what he means there by saying actions that are pursued for the sake of something else are not perfect. Now, why is he making this distinction? Why does he do this as he begins to pursue this investigation? He's trying to identify what the ultimate good, the perfect end, what the ultimate good must be like. The ultimate good can't be something that's merely instrumental. It can't be something that we want as a means to something else. The ultimate good is going to have to be something that we want for its own sake, that when we obtain it, all of our actions cease. What is it? What is that ultimate end in which human nature can rest? That's the question Aristotle's asking. And again, he's arguing from common sense. We can see, we all know this. We all know that there are some things that are done for the sake of other things. And those things for which they're done are their ends. And the ends are superior to the actions. We all know that by common sense. And now we have to ask, what would the ultimate end be like? It has to be something that we desire for its own sake. It has to be something that when we reach it, we rest. What is that ultimate end? He goes on and says, that which is most excellent appears to be something perfect, so that if there is only one certain perfect end, this will be what we investigate. But if there are many, it would be the most perfect of these. So we're trying to identify the subject of this investigation. Aristotle argues that what is most excellent must be something that's perfect. And a perfect end is one that is complete in itself. It doesn't point us beyond itself to something else. If there is only one perfect end, and Aristotle hasn't proven yet that there is one perfect end, he's saying if there is only one perfect end, that all other ends are instrumental, and there's just one perfect end, then that would be what we're looking for, the ultimate human good. And if there are many perfect ends, which there may be, we don't know yet, if there are many perfect ends, then what we would want would be the most perfect of those many different ends, those many perfect ends. We'd want the one that's most perfect. So Aristotle is revealing to us here his method for investigation. And it's important for us to pay attention to this because as much as we want to study and learn Aristotle's philosophy, we want to learn Aristotle's answers to many of these philosophical questions, we also want to learn how to answer these questions ourselves. Because we're going to face questions that Aristotle hasn't necessarily answered. So we want to learn his method so that we can put it to work on philosophical problems or questions that he hasn't answered. So we want to do both. He's showing us his method here. He's not just making arbitrary claims. He's not jumping to assumptions, not jumping to conclusions. He's reasoning from what we already know. He's reasoning from common knowledge, common sense. And he's concluding that we all can see, we all agree that excellence is associated with this idea of perfection. And perfection means completeness. And if that's true, then the ultimate good must be something that's complete, that feels complete and perfect. So he's establishing a qualification for that ultimate end, something that can direct our investigation. What are we looking for? We're looking for the perfect end. We're looking for the final end. The ultimate good must be something complete and perfect. He goes on and says, quote, "We denominate, however, that which is pursuable for its own sake, more perfect than that which is pursuable for the sake of something else, and that which is never eligible on account of another thing, than things which are eligible both on their own account and for the sake of something else." So Aristotle defines here what he means by perfect. Something is more perfect if it's pursued for its own sake, rather than for the sake of something else. Something is more perfect if it's never chosen for the sake of something else, but only for its own sake. So notice what Aristotle's doing here is he's creating a scoring system, as it were, that we can use to rank different ends. We can score different ends. We can say the perfect end is something that's sought for its own sake. An inferior or instrumental end is something that's pursued for the sake of something else. And maybe there are some ends that are both pursued for their own sake and pursued for the sake of something else. So we want to look at the different ends and rank them because we want to try to find what the most perfect end might be. So let's think about this. Suppose, for example, that you study music. You might study music for its own sake because you love music and find joy in music itself. Or you might study music for the sake of some other end, like you want to impress people or entertain people, or you want to earn money. If you study music for its own sake, then that's more perfect than studying it for the sake of making money. So we can see how these different ends can be ranked and scored, as it were, in Aristotle's system. But there's an even higher level of perfection. There are some things, or there could be something, that's the question, that is never chosen for the sake of something else, but only for itself. And if there is something that is never chosen for the sake of something else, but only for itself, and all of our action ends there, then that would be the ultimate good. That would be the ultimate good. That will be the goal of our investigation. He says, quote, "In short, the completely perfect is that which is always eligible on its own account and never on account of something else. The completely perfect is that which is always chosen for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. That is the definition of the ultimate good. It's something that we want for itself and not as a mean for anything else." Aristotle goes on and says, quote, Happiness especially appears to be a thing of this kind. Happiness appears to be a thing of this kind, for we always choose happiness on its own account, and never on account of anything else. So Aristotle proposes what he thinks the ultimate end might be, and he's presenting this as if it's open for debate. He's saying to us, what do you think? As I consider what I observe, and I think about what the ultimate end would be, it seems to me that happiness would be that thing. Happiness would be that thing which is always chosen on its own account and never on account of something else. Aristotle proposes happiness as the ultimate good. Happiness is always chosen for its own sake. We never choose happiness as a means to something else. When we ask someone, why do you want to be happy? That question seems strange. Why do I want to be happy? We want to be happy for no reason other than that happiness is good in itself. Now, this from Aristotle is a profound observation about human nature, and we shouldn't just take it for granted. Everyone desires happiness. All human beings desire happiness, and everyone desires happiness for its own sake, not as a means to something else. The universal human desire for happiness suggests that happiness may indeed be the ultimate human good. Aristotle goes on and says, quote, "We choose honor and pleasure and intellect and every virtue on their own account indeed. For though we should derive no farther advantage than what the possession of them affords, yet each of them would be the object of our choice. Yet we also choose them for the sake of happiness." Let me read that again. "We choose honor and pleasure and intellect and every virtue on their own account or for their own sake. Indeed, for though we should derive no farther advantage than what the possession of each of them affords, each of them would be the object of our choice, but we also choose them for the sake of happiness." So here we see that Aristotle makes an important distinction. There are many things that we choose for their own sake. He's not saying happiness is the only thing we choose for its own sake. We choose many things for their own sake. We choose honor, some of us choose honor. Some choose pleasure. We talked about that earlier in chapter 5 when we looked at the different kinds of lives that men lead. Some choose honor as that which they seek. Some choose pleasure as that which they seek. But that's really not ultimately what they're choosing. They're looking for something more than just that. We choose those things, it's true, even though they bring us no other advantage in this world. We choose them for their own sake. We value them in themselves, and we value different things in different degrees in that way. However, there's something more that we're seeking through those things. We're choosing those things really not ultimately for their own sake. Ultimately, we're choosing them for the sake of happiness, because we judge them to bring us happiness. We pursue virtue because it makes us happy. Remember, moral philosophy has to do with pleasure and pain. We pursue virtue because it brings us pleasure. It makes us happy. We seek pleasure, as in bodily pleasure, because it contributes to our happiness. We desire honor because it's part of a happy life. So Aristotle's showing us that even though we may think there are things that we pursue for their own sake, there's really more to this pursuit. He shows that happiness is really the ultimate end that we're all seeking, even if we disagree on what we desire. There is actually something that we're all seeking in common, and it's happiness. We pursue all these things for the sake of happiness, even though they may be good in themselves. They're chosen by us because they contribute to happiness. He says, quote, "No one chooses happiness for the sake of these. No one chooses happiness in the other direction for the sake of these other ends, nor in short for the sake of anything else." Aristotle points out that this is what's unique about happiness. We pursue virtue for the sake of happiness. We pursue honor for the sake of happiness. We pursue pleasure for the sake of happiness. But no one pursues happiness for the sake of pleasure, or happiness for the sake of honor, or happiness for the sake of virtue. Happiness is only sought in one direction, and happiness is the end, the perfect end that's sought. It's never a means to something else. It's always the ultimate end. And this is a crucial point in Aristotle's philosophy here. It shows that happiness is fundamentally different from all other goods. All other goods can be pursued for their own sake or for the sake of happiness, but happiness is pursued only for its own sake. Aristotle says, as we begin part 3, "The same thing also appears to happen from that which enables a man to be sufficient to himself. For perfect good appears to be self-sufficient." Perfect good appears to be self-sufficient. So Aristotle now approaches this question of what happiness is from a different angle. He argues here that the perfect good, if there is a perfect good, it must be self-sufficient. It must be self-sufficient. And by self-sufficient, he means that it contains everything needed to make life worth living. It must be self-sufficient. It must be all that we need. A self-sufficient good is a good that lacks nothing essential. Why? Why is this true? Why must the ultimate good be self-sufficient. Because if it lacked something, it could not be the ultimate good. If happiness required something else to complete it, then that something else would be part of the ultimate good, and happiness alone would not be the perfect good. So it must be self-sufficient. Aristotle goes on and says, but we call the self-sufficient that which is not only sufficient to him who lives a solitary life, but which is also sufficient to parents and children, to a wife, and in short, to friends and fellow citizens, since man is naturally a political animal. So it's not enough to say it's sufficient for the man alone, but it's also sufficient for everyone else, because man is by nature political. So he clarifies here what he means by self-sufficient. He doesn't have this selfish idea of a man retiring alone by himself to live happily in isolation. Human nature isn't designed to work like that. He clarifies exactly what he means by self-sufficient. It doesn't mean living alone in isolation and claiming to have everything that you want. Self-sufficiency for a human being who is a political animal includes having the relationships that are natural to human beings. Again, man is naturally a political animal. One proof of this that we'll learn in the future in philosophy, one proof of this is language. If man was intended to live alone, he wouldn't have the ability to communicate, to speak, and so on. Man is made with language, skills, and reason because he's meant to live in community. Man is given the power of reason primarily for the sake of justice, which only makes sense in community. So man is designed for community or for political life. And so real self-sufficiency includes having all of the relationships that are natural to human beings. We're naturally social beings who live in communities and different kinds of communities. So self-sufficiency must include having parents, children, a spouse, friends, fellow citizens, and so on. Doesn't mean that we have to have all of these, but true self-sufficiency is self-sufficiency for a human being who is created as a political animal. And that's a very important point because it clarifies what happiness must actually be. Aristotle recognizes that human happiness is not something achieved in isolation by one person. We're social beings. Our happiness includes our relationships with others. A truly happy person has friends, has family, has a community, and so on. Happiness, therefore, must relate to these relations. Aristotle says, quote, "A certain boundary, however, must be assumed of these things. A certain boundary must be assumed, for if good is to be extended to parents and their offspring, and to the friends of friends, there would be a procession to infinity." We have to set a limit to these relationships because there would be a procession to infinity. And one of the principles of natural philosophy is that nothing in nature can proceed to infinity. So Aristotle here recognizes a practical problem that has to be addressed in this investigation. If we just keep extending, just because man is a social animal doesn't mean that his relations extend infinitely. If we keep extending that circle of people whose well-being is necessary for our happiness, if it were to go on forever, we would go on forever, and that would be impossible. There must be some reasonable, or I would say some natural limit to this circle that influences our happiness or defines or limits our happiness or what true happiness is. There must be some limit. Now, Aristotle, notice he doesn't tell us what that limit is, but he acknowledges that there just by reason alone, we can see that there must be some limit, right? How many levels of family life am I responsible for? How many levels of relationships determine whether I'm happy or not? There's got to be some natural limit. Living in isolation is unreasonable and unnatural because man is a social animal. He's responsible for his parents, for example. Honor your father and your mother is one of the 10 commandments of the moral law. We're responsible for our relationship with our parents. A man can't be good who doesn't maintain a proper relation to his parents. The same is true if a man marries. The same is true for his spouse. If a man has children, he's responsible for his children. If he has siblings, if he has members of his community, parishioners, fellow citizens, and so on, there are certain relationships that he has, certain responsibilities to these people, but there has to be some natural limit to those circles. And Aristotle acknowledges that there must be a limit. It doesn't go on forever. So he doesn't solve that problem here, but he draws our attention to it and acknowledges that this is limited. This idea of man as a social animal is limited. And he's going to return to that later in this discussion. Remember, this is ultimately going to be a discussion about political science because it's this happiness of the community that is the ultimate end, as we'll see. The point that he's making, which is important for us now, is that while happiness includes our relations with others, we can't make ourselves responsible for the happiness of an infinite number of people. And we see this in modern society all the time. Well, we see this in American politics, for example, in the America First debate. The question is, do the American citizens have a responsibility to see that a community in Africa has everything that it needs? If America lives with a certain constitution and a certain economic policy, it has a certain culture and so on, and it's prosperous and thriving, can the Americans enjoy that prosperity, or are they obligated to make sure that every African gets fed? You can see how this argument is made, and Americans are challenged and made to feel guilty that if there's someone in the world who's hungry, no American can enjoy the prosperity of their own culture. So that's a relevant political question that we literally debate this election by election, even day by day, this question of what is the extent of our responsibility and how does our happiness relate to the society, whether there's a limit to that society or not. Just because we're a social animal doesn't mean that the society is every single person in every single place on the entire planet. Or we could even extend it to the future. What about your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren? Are you also providing everything that they're going to? You can see that becomes an argument that is reduced to absurdity. And that's Aristotle's point here. So he wants to draw our attention to this point, that this relational nature, this social nature of man doesn't go on forever. There has to be a natural limit. And he'll talk about that later. He says, in fact, quote, "But this indeed we shall consider hereafter." So we're going to talk about that later. He then says, quote, "We call, however, the self-sufficient that which, subsisting by itself alone, makes life eligible and in want of nothing. So here he clarifies what self-sufficient means. We call the self-sufficient that which, subsisting by itself alone, makes life eligible and in want of nothing. Now you'll notice him using this term eligible, and remember, we're reading an English translation. This word eligible means worthy of choosing. Remember we talked about deliberate choice. Eligible means that something is desirable or worthy of choosing. So the self-sufficient is that which, subsisting by itself, makes life desirable, makes life worthy of choosing, and in want of nothing else. So Aristotle returns to defining this term of self-sufficiency and says, the self-sufficient is that which, existing by itself, makes life worth living and lacks nothing essential. That's a positive definition for self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency is not merely the absence of need. That would be a negative definition. Self-sufficiency is not just to not need anything. It's also to possess everything that makes life good, everything that makes life enjoyable. That's the definition of self-sufficiency. And before I go on, let me just make a quick note. Notice how careful Aristotle is to define terms. He's such a great teacher. He never presents us with an important term that he doesn't clearly define, very clearly define, and go on to describe with examples and illustrations and qualifications. Notice how carefully he thinks and teaches, and don't take that for granted, because when you get into other writers, you'll find that they don't teach as carefully as Aristotle does. So let's keep going here. Aristotle says, after establishing a definition for self-sufficient, says, we think that happiness is a thing of this kind. We think that happiness is a thing of this kind. So Aristotle concludes that if we go through the qualifications of what it means to be self-sufficient, happiness meets these qualifications. Happiness makes life worth living. And a happy person, a person who has happiness, lacks nothing essential for a good life. Another quick note, if you read the Confessions of St. Augustine, one of the life-changing moments in Augustine's life is, he's this successful, brilliant, honorable Roman citizen living in the 4th century. And he's got all of these gifts, all of these privileges and opportunities. His life materially and socially seems to be so rich, and yet within himself he's unhappy. He doesn't have happiness. He has all of these things, but he doesn't have happiness. And there's one story he tells where one day he's traveling and he sees this what appears to be a homeless man in the street. And this man in the street has nothing. He has none of the things that Augustine has. And yet this man, Augustine can see that this man is happy. And Augustine realizes that day that all the things that he has are not worth happiness. And so in that story there from the Confessions of St. Augustine, we have an example, a real historical example of this sense that it's better to have nothing and have happiness than to have all of these riches, all of these benefits and privileges without happiness. It appears in the life of that poor man that happiness is a self-sufficient good and may be the ultimate good. So just an important historical note from the life of St. Augustine, which goes along with Aristotle's teaching here. A happy person lacks nothing essential for a good life. Aristotle says, besides this, we think that happiness is the most eligible of all things, and it is not connaumerated with any other good. For if it were connaumerated, that means numbered with, or included with. If it were connaumerated with even the smallest good, it is evident that it would be more eligible, since that which is added would become an excess of good. And so he makes another important point here. He says that happiness is, or appears to be, the most eligible of all things, the most worthy of choice, the most desirable of all things. And again, that word connaumerated means counted together with or taken together with. He argues that happiness can't be combined with any other goods as if they were separate things to be added together. And the reason why he says that is because if you could add even the smallest additional good to happiness, the result would be more desirable than happiness alone. But we've already established that happiness is the most eligible of all things. Therefore, nothing could be added to happiness that would make it better. Happiness is complete in itself. Happiness is complete in itself. If you have happiness, you have everything. Now, someone might object to that. And I'll give you an example from something that St. Teresa of Avila supposedly said. She supposedly said that God is good, but God and chocolate is even better. So you could make an argument like that even though something is the ultimate good, other things added to it would make it better. But Aristotle says that's actually not the case, because the thing that's good in and of itself is not made better by the addition of other things. And of course, I don't think St. Teresa was being serious when she said that. But we have that kind of an idea. If I could have a saving relationship with God, would that not be the ultimate end of my life? But if I could have that saving relationship and also be wealthy, wouldn't that be better? The answer is actually no, not necessarily. Not necessarily. So it's worth thinking about and keeping in mind, because we tend to feel that way at times, and we take possession of the ultimate good for granted and give our attention to other things. And if we notice lacking those other things causes us to lose our happiness because we're seeking to add other things to happiness itself, and that's actually causing our vexation or our loss of happiness. So we see it actually doesn't work that way. So happiness is the most eligible of all things. Happiness is complete in itself, and it's not necessarily a good idea to think that adding something to it would make it better. In fact, trying to add something to it might cause us to lose it. And Aristotle says, quote, "The greater good is always more eligible." The greater good is always more eligible. He shows that happiness isn't just one good among many, it's the supreme good. It encompasses all other goods. And then he gives us this general principle. A greater good is always more eligible or more desirable than a lesser good. That seems obvious. If one thing is better than something else, we would prefer the better thing. But as we know from experience, we don't always think like that. We very often choose inferior things because of our corruption and sin, and because of our ability to be deceived and tempted away from the ultimate good. Aristotle says, quote, "Happiness, therefore, appears to be something perfect and sufficient to itself, the end of actions." Happiness appears to be something perfect and sufficient to itself, the end of actions. So Aristotle summarizes what he has found in his consideration of happiness. He says that it's perfect, it's complete in itself, it's self-sufficient, it contains everything needed for a good life, and it's the end of all actions. It's the ultimate purpose toward which all of our actions are directed. So having established that, Aristotle now begins to move on more specifically to the consideration of man. He says, quote, "Perhaps, however, to say that happiness is the best of things is to assert that which is acknowledged by all men. But it is requisite that we should yet more clearly say what it is." So he acknowledges that everyone agrees that happiness is the best thing, but agreement on the name happiness doesn't mean that we agree on what happiness actually is. So we still haven't settled this problem. We need to understand what happiness actually consists of, not just say that happiness is the best thing. And this is another important point in Aristotle's method of investigation. In philosophy and in arguments in general, we often find that people agree on general principles, but they disagree on what those principles mean, especially in practice. So we can say that we agree, but we disagree on the interpretation of a general principle, or we disagree on the application of a general principle. We see this in Christian circles all the time. We can say we believe in the Catholic Church or we believe in the Bible, and we can all nod and say, yes, that's true, we agree. But then as soon as it comes time to talk about what we should do or what the Bible actually means, there's disagreement. So having agreement among all men on a general principle is really not helpful for us. We've got to go deeper, and that's going to lead us into controversy, and we're going to have to be more careful to prove what we say. So just because we agree on the name doesn't mean we agree on what happiness actually is. Aristotle is committed as a great teacher, and this is one of the great comforts of philosophy, is that the philosophers go beyond this superficial agreement, and they get after the real understanding of the concept in specific. So we're going to get beyond this general agreement and get into the details of what happiness necessarily consists of based on human nature. He says, quote, "Perhaps this will be effected if the work of man is assumed. Perhaps this will be effected, or perhaps this can be accomplished if the work of man, the work that's proper to man, is assumed." So let's start by looking at man and his work, or the function of man. This is part 4. So Aristotle proposes a method. He says, I've got an idea of how we can answer this question and get down to the details. He proposes a method for figuring out what happiness is. He says, let's examine the work or the function of man. If we understand what man is meant to do, then we can understand what human happiness must consist of. Again, if we can understand what man is meant to do, what is man's purpose, then we can understand what happiness must consist of. This is what's called the argument from function, the function argument in Aristotelian philosophy. He argues that everything has a function or a purpose, and excellence consists in performing that function well, doing your job. That's what it means to be excellent, fulfilling your potential or fulfilling your purpose. He says, quote, "For as to the player on the flute, to the statuary or statue maker, and to every artist, and in short, To those who have a certain work and action, the good and the excellent appear to be in their work. This also may appear to be the case with man in general, if he has a certain work. So in other words, we value the flute player, we value the statue maker and the artist by the work that they produce. And what he says, if this is true of artists, that we judge excellence by the work that they do, maybe it's true for man in general. Maybe it's true that man's work, man has some ultimate work that's true for all of man. And we should judge man and we should judge human excellence by the completion or performance of that work. That reasoning that he makes here is based on an observation again. We can see that excellence is always related to function. A good knife is a knife that cuts well. It performs its function well. A good horse is one that runs well. A good eye is one that sees well. So in every case, we judge excellence based on whether the thing performs its function well. And again, that's the argument from function. Aristotle says, quote, "Whether, therefore, are there certain works and actions indeed of a carpenter and a shoemaker, but of man is there no work? Is he naturally indolent? Whether are there certain works and actions indeed of a carpenter and shoemaker, but of man there is no work? Is he naturally indolent?" Indolent means idle or lazy. So Aristotle asks this rhetorical question, a clever rhetorical question. He says, we see different kinds of men. We see carpenters have a specific work. They make things from wood. We see that shoemakers have a specific work. They make shoes. But does man in general, does man as a species have no specific work? Is human nature, is man as a species naturally lazy or idle? Or is there some work, some function that man is to perform? The answer seems to be no, that man is not lazy or idle. He must have some function. And that rhetorical question that Aristotle asks is meant to make us see that man must have some specific function. There must be some function for man. There must be some work that man as a species is expected to perform. Aristotle goes on, quote, "Or shall we say that as of the eye, as of the hand and the foot, and in short, of each of the parts of the body, there appears to be a certain work or function, so likewise of man? Shall we admit that besides all these parts, there is a certain work? Is there a work for the whole man, just as there is obviously a purpose or a function for all of the parts of man?" So this is another line of reasoning, another argument. He says each part of the man's body has a specific function. The eye sees, the hand grasps or holds things, the foot walks. Every part of man has a function, but the whole person has no function? That doesn't make any sense. The whole person must have some function. And the function of the whole can't be the same as the function of the parts, but it should be the coordinated activity of all of the parts working together. It should be the end for which all of these different parts are working. That seems obvious. And again, this is another important principle. In a living thing, the parts have their own functions, but these functions are coordinated or aligned toward the function of the whole living thing. The eye's function, seeing, serves the function of the whole person. The hand's function, holding things or grasping things, serves the function of the whole person. There must be a function of the whole person. So Aristotle asks, quote, "What then will this work be?" What is this work? So he asks, what is the function of man as man? What is the function of man? Now, he's going to answer that question by using a process of elimination. In other words, he's going to propose possible answers for what man's work might be and eliminate those that can't possibly be true. And perhaps that will leave us with the answer to the question, what is the function of man? And this begins part 5, identifying the human function. Aristotle says, quote, to live appears to be common also to plants as well as to men. Is the function of man to live? And again, he's using the process of elimination. So option number 1, answer choice A, the function of man is to live. Well, living is something that plants can do, just as well as humans. So living can't be the unique function of man. If it were the unique function of man, then plants would be performing the function of man, which obviously makes no sense. And this helps us to see and understand Aristotle's method. In order to find what is unique to humans, what their function is, we must eliminate any functions that humans share with other living things. So that's how we're going to use this process of elimination. Aristotle says, quote, the peculiar work of man is now investigated. And peculiar can also be translated as proper. The proper work of man, the work which belongs to man alone, is now what we're investigating. So he reminds us we're looking for what is peculiar or unique to man. What distinguishes human function from the functions of other living things? So he goes on to answer choice B. He says, the nutritive and augmentative life, therefore, must be rejected. So option B is a nutritive and augmentative life. What does that mean? The nutritive life means a life of taking in nourishment, of eating and digesting foods. The augmentative life is a life of growth. So is man's purpose to eat and grow? Is that man's purpose? That can't be man's purpose. Why? Because these, again, are functions that plants can perform. And we're looking for a work that's unique to humans. We have to reject these as the human function. Man's purpose is not to merely live. It's not to consume food or process food and grow. That can be done by inferior living creatures. That can't be man's purpose. So he shows that the human function can't be merely biological. It can't be something that's shared with other physical living things. It's not about eating, drinking, growing. These things are a part of human life, but they're not what makes man distinctly human. They're not peculiarly or properly human functions. He then goes on to another option. He says, a certain sensitive life will be consequent to this. The next option is man is to live a sensitive life. And by this, what he means is a life where man senses and perceives different things, where he perceives things, he receives information by means of the senses. Is he like a sensor, like a living sensor that just receives information by means of sensation? Is that the purpose of man? Aristotle says it appears that this sensitive life is also common to a horse or to an ox and to every other animal. So that doesn't seem to be a function unique to men. Sensation is common to animals. Horses and oxen can see, they can hear, they can smell, they can taste, they can feel. So as amazing as our senses may be, they're shared with inferior animals. So if sensation were the unique work of man, then horses and oxen could be performing the human function, which doesn't make any sense. He goes on then to say this: a certain practic life accompanied with reason remains. This is, it seems, the last choice available. A certain practic life accompanied with reason. So Aristotle concludes here that the human function must be some practical life that's accompanied with reason. And the word practic, which is the English translation used here, it just refers to action or practice. So there must be a practical life that man is supposed to live, and it's a practical life accompanied with reason. Only man could live that life. Only man could perform that function. And that function is not merely to live, not merely to make use of the senses, but to act according to reason. So this is the unique function of man. The unique function of man is to act with reason. That's what distinguishes him from all other living things. Man's unique function is to act according to reason. And that's the crucial insight here for Aristotle. What distinguishes humans from other animals is the ability to reason. We're the only creatures capable of rational thought and rational action. Therefore, the human function must involve the exercise, not the mere possession of reason, but the action of reason, or the exercise of reason. Aristotle goes on and says, quote, "But of this, one kind is obedient to reason, but the other possesses reason and energizes discursively." Now that's some confusing language. Let me read that again. Of this practic life accompanied with reason, one kind is obedient to reason, but the other possesses reason and energizes discursively. So Aristotle distinguishes two different aspects of this rational life. He says one aspect is obedient to reason. One aspect is obedient to reason, and he's talking about the part of the soul which can be trained to follow reason, the appetitive part. We'll learn about that later. One part of the soul, one aspect of this human life can be trained to follow reason, but the other aspect possesses reason and acts discursively. The other aspect possesses reason and acts discursively. This refers to the rational part of the soul that thinks and reasons. That's what this word discursively refers to. So two different aspects, one that is subject to reason and the other that actively reasons, the rational part of the soul. So in other words, humans have both a rational part, the intellect, and a part that is trained to follow reason, the appetite and emotions. Both of these are involved in the human function. Both of these are involved, these two different aspects of the human life. Aristotle says, quote, "Since this life is predicated in a twofold respect, that is, according to energy and according to habit, it must be admitted to subsist according to energy, for this appears to be predicated according to a more principal mode of subsistence. Again, heavy philosophical language, but not difficult to understand if we take it apart and study it piece by piece. Let me repeat that. Since this human life, this practical life according to reason, is predicated in a twofold respect, it has two parts. That is, according to energy, or this active discursive reasoning, and according to habit, in that part of the soul which is made obedient to reason. It must be admitted that this human life subsists according to energy. For this, the energy of the soul appears to be predicated according to a more principal mode of subsistence. Just think about that simply. If the one part actively reasons and the other part submits to reason, or can be made to submit to reason, it's clear that the reasoning part is the principal part. That's what he's saying here. It must be admitted that the human life subsists according to energy because this appears to be predicated according to a more principal mode of subsistence. So he makes an important distinction here between potentiality and actuality. The rational life of man can be understood in two ways: according to habit, that is, potential, and according to energy or actuality, the actual exercising of reason. A habit, he mentions habit, a habit is a stable disposition or a capacity. A person who's learned to play the harp, for example, has the habit, this stable capacity, this disposition of playing the harp. They have the capacity to play the harp even when they're not actually playing it. Energy or actuality is the actual exercise of that capacity. When the person is actually playing the harp, they're exercising the energy of harp playing. So Aristotle argues that the human function must be understood according to energy, actuality, not merely according to habit or potential. Why? Because the actual exercise of that capacity, the actual exercise of reasoning, is a more principal or primary mode of existence than merely having that capacity. We can think of it like this. A person who knows how to play the harp but never plays the harp is not fulfilling the function of a harp player. The harp player's function is fulfilled when they're actively playing the harp. So in the same way, the human function is not fulfilled by having the capacity for reason, but by actually or actively exercising reason. And that's a crucial point here for understanding Aristotle's ethics. Happiness, we're going to see, is not merely having habits, not merely having or possessing virtue. Happiness is the actual exercise of the virtues in action, the active use of reason. That's where human happiness consists. So happiness, and this begins part 6, happiness is a virtuous activity. Happiness is a virtuous activity. Aristotle says this: if the work of man is the energy or the activity of the soul according to reason, or not without reason. And we say that the same thing is the work of the human species and of a worthy man, just as the same thing is the work of a harper and of a good harper. And in short, this is the case in all things. Excellence, according to virtue, being added to the work. For the work of the harper is to play the harp, and the work of a good harper is to play the harp well. If this be the case, and we admit that the work of man is a certain life, and this to be the energy of the soul, and actions in conjunction with reason, by a worthy man, these things are well and beautifully performed, and everything is well accomplished according to the proper virtue. If this be the case, then human good will be the energy of the soul according to virtue. Human good will be the energy of the soul according to virtue. Now that's a long and complex sentence there, and I kept it all together because it's Aristotle's reasoning to the human good based on the human function. It's all one long chain of reasoning. And one of the challenges in philosophy is learning to follow long chains of reasoning. So it's a long and complicated sentence, but let's work through it little by little. Aristotle begins by restating what we've already established. He says, the work of man is the energy of the soul according to reason, or at least not without reason. He then makes an important observation. He says, the work of the human species, of the whole class of men, and the work of a worthy or excellent man are the same thing. So what makes a man excellent, an individual man, what makes him an excellent man is that he performs the work of the human species. An excellent man performs that work excellently. That's what excellence is about. That's what an excellent man is. He performs the function of man excellently. And he gives an example of a harp player. The work of a harp player is to play on the harp. The work of a good harp player is also to play on the harp. The difference is that the good harp player plays the harp well, while another harp player may play the harp poorly. So in all things, Aristotle reasons, excellence is added to the work. To be an excellent man is to do the work of man excellently. Excellence consists in performing one's work well, performing one's function well. So now applying this to humans in general, Aristotle reasons the work of man is a certain kind of life. It's the energy of the soul, or the action of the soul, and it's actions of the soul according to reason. So a worthy or an excellent man is a man who performs this work well and beautifully. Everything the man does is accomplished according to its proper virtue. So human good or happiness is the energy of the soul according to virtue. This is Aristotle's definition of happiness. So it's obviously most important, and I'll repeat it. Human good or happiness is the energy of the soul according to virtue. Happiness is the energy of the soul according to virtue. In other words, happiness is the excellent performance of the human function. The excellent performance of the human function. And the human function is the exercise of reason in action. So what it means to be happy is to perform the human function with excellence. The human function is the exercise of reason in action, and happiness is to perform that action with excellence. This is Aristotle's definition of happiness. No vague ideas, no general principles. Notice he has given a very specific definition to happiness. Happiness isn't a feeling. It's not a state of mind. It's not a condition. It's not a set of circumstances. Happiness is an activity. It's the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Happiness is an activity. It's the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Aristotle says, quote, "If there are many virtues, it will be the energy of the soul according to the best and most perfect virtue, and besides this, in a perfect life." Aristotle recognizes that there are many virtues. We're going to study them in this book. There are many virtues: courage, temperance, justice, prudence, and so on. There are many virtues. And if there are many virtues, then happiness must be the activity of the soul according to the best and most perfect virtue. And on top of that, this activity that makes for human happiness must occur in a perfect life. What's meant by a perfect life? A perfect life, as we saw earlier, is a complete life. Not just a moment of good action, not just one day or a certain period of life, but a complete life of this activity. A complete life performing the function of human nature in an excellent way. Happiness requires the sustained exercise of virtue over one's whole lifetime. Happiness requires the sustained exercise of virtue over a person's whole lifetime. It's not a moment. It's a stable habit of life. Quote, "As one swallow does not make spring, nor one day, so neither does one day nor a little time make a man blessed and happy. As one swallow does not make spring." What Aristotle's referring to there is one of Aesop's fables. One swallow does not make spring. Just because you see one bird, in America we would say a robin is the harbinger of springtime. But if you see one robin, that doesn't mean spring is here. One swallow does not make spring. One warm day near the end of winter does not mean it's spring. And in the same way, Aristotle says, so neither does one day of good action or a little time of doing what one should, performing the function of man well, that does not make a man blessed or happy. So he uses this beautiful image of the swallow being interpreted as a sign of the spring and saying that's obviously not true. One swallow or one day doesn't make spring. In the same way, a short time or a period of activity that doesn't become habitual or characteristic of the person doesn't make a person blessed and happy. Happiness requires a whole lifetime of virtuous activity. And that's an important point because happiness isn't something that can be achieved in a moment. It's not a temporary feeling. It's not the experience of a certain set of circumstances. It's a state that develops over time through the consistent practice of virtue. Happiness requires a whole life of virtuous activity. It's a state that develops over time through the consistent practice of virtue. Aristotle then says, "Let this, therefore, be a description of the good. For it is necessary, perhaps, as in a picture, first to delineate, and afterwards add the colors." So Aristotle reflects on the nature of definition and explanation. He says that what he has given so far is really not a technical philosophical definition. He's given us a description of what is good. And he says it's like drawing a picture. First, you sketch or outline, you delineate the basic shape or image. And then afterwards, after the sketch has been made, then you can go and add all the details. And what he has done, he says, is he has now sketched this outline of what happiness is. He's shown us that happiness is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. There you have your sketch. Happiness is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. But that's just a sketch. The details now need to be filled in as we go on through this book, through the Nicomachean Ethics, and study all of the individual virtues, which are like the details and colors of this drawing. So again, this is another look at Aristotle's method of investigation. He's not even attempting to give a complete and final definition up front, even though I would argue he has. He's not claiming that he's given a final definition because we haven't yet learned all the details. He's given us an outline or a sketch that he's now going to develop and refine as we go through the rest of this study. He says, quote, "It would seem that anyone may be able to educe and distinctly arrange things which are well delineated, and that time is the inventor of, or a good cooperator with, things of this kind. Whence also accessions are made to the arts, for anyone may add to what is wanting." Aristotle says that anyone can take a well-drawn outline and develop it further, fill it out, color it in, as it were. Time and experience, he says, help us to develop and refine our understanding. This is how arts progress. People build on what has been done before, adding to it and improving it. And it's worth noting that an ancient phrase that I quote often is that the beginning is half of the whole. The beginning of a work is half of the whole. In other words, laying out the sketch looks like it's just the beginning. It looks like we really haven't done anything yet, but the sketch or the outline actually orders the entire study. And so the work of the master, the great benefit that Aristotle gives to us, is that he has worked out this sketch for us. And he's led us along from common observations, common knowledge, to this point where we now have this true idea of happiness sketched out or outlined in front of us. And now we have the opportunity to go on and study and fill in all the details. But the work that he's done in leading us to this point and providing us with this sketch has given us much of what we need to move forward in this investigation with a sense of order and confidence that we're now adding to this sketch that's worth filling in, that's worth finishing. So remember, the beginning is half of the whole. And this this teaching from Aristotle, again, reveals his character to us. He's humble. It shows us his humility. He can recognize that what he's doing is not going to be the final word. This isn't going to be the end of the study. He's saying that he is laying a foundation. He's preparing things that he knows others are going to build on and finish. It's going to be improved by others, and in God's providence, it's brought to fulfillment by St. Thomas Aquinas in Scholastic philosophy, when the benefit and the help of divine revelation comes to fill in all the details. So Aristotle acknowledges that 300 plus years before the Christian era. He knows that it's going to continually be developed by others who follow him, because he knows that knowledge develops over time through the contributions of many different gifted people. And we have here an important look at the whole idea of development of knowledge, which is part of Catholic theology, the development of doctrine. He says, quote, "It's also requisite to call to mind what has been before said, and not to search for accuracy similarly in all things, but to investigate it in each according to the subject matter, and so far as is appropriate to the method pertaining to the inquiry." So not only are we just getting started here in this study of ethics, Aristotle says, but we also have to be reasonable when we think about how accurate this art or this science is going to be. How accurate can moral philosophy be? How accurate is our understanding of happiness and virtue going to be? Accuracy is relative to the science or the subject that's being studied. And this is another important point that allows us to see Aristotle's philosophical method. We have to remember what has already been said. We shouldn't demand the same level of precision in every subject. We should investigate every subject with a level of precision, or with an expected level of precision that's appropriate for that subject. Why? Because all of these different subjects are different natures. They have different natures. Some subjects are of a certain nature that allows for great precision. Other subjects don't. And that's simply true. That's real. So we should adjust our expectations according to the subject. We shouldn't come to ethics looking for the exactness that we look for in Euclidean geometry, for example. He says, quote, "For a carpenter and a geometrician investigate a right angle differently. The carpenter investigates a right angle or a measurement as far as it's necessary for the usefulness in his work. But a geometrician explores what a right angle actually is, or what the quality is which it possesses. So both a carpenter and a geometrician study right angles, but because they're studying them in different contexts as parts of different arts or sciences, they study them differently. The carpenter doesn't need an exact definition or measure. He needs a measure that's good enough for his purposes, whereas the geometrician is looking for an exact, precise definition and description. Both of these approaches, both of the carpenter and the geometrician, they're both valid and reasonable. The carpenter's approach is appropriate for his purposes. The geometer's approach is appropriate for his purpose. And in the same way, we shouldn't demand that the carpenter measure like the geometer or the geometrician. And at the same time, if we're studying geometry, we shouldn't go about it as if we were carpenters, looking just for what is useful. Now, that principle, Aristotle says, applies to ethics. We shouldn't demand the same level of precision in our study of ethics as we demand in mathematics. Ethics deals with human nature and human action. It's not a precise science. It's not like unchanging mathematical objects or the study of mathematical objects whose nature is timeless and unchanging. In ethics, we have to investigate human activity with a level of precision that's appropriate for the subject matter. And so we've got to adjust our expectations and go about this study in a reasonable way. He says, after the same manner, we must proceed in other things, lest what is superfluous should become more abundant than the works themselves. We need to proceed in the same way in other investigations. We should not demand more precision than the subject matter reasonably allows. Now, people will do this who are contentious. They'll pretend that they want an exact answer or an exact measure. Let's say of food. What should I eat? I want to know exactly how many calories, how many ounces, how many cups, how many this, how many that. Tell me exactly. That's not wisdom. That's not realistic. They're usually doing that to find an excuse to get out of actually living and eating temperately. So we have to look for a level of precision in these studies that's appropriate for the nature of the subject. If we don't do that, if we go beyond what's reasonable, then we'll get lost in all kind of excessive, superfluous details that will actually obscure what we're trying to find. It'll make things more confusing and actually become an obstacle to what we're trying to learn. So we have to temper our expectations for precision. We can't look for mechanical rules in ethics because the subject is more complex than that. And if we try to do that, we'll end up creating this system of all kinds of details and distractions that will end up leading us nowhere. We see that today in modern science. It's what modern science does by habit. They try to make everything mathematically precise, and they end up not even being able to tell us what's healthy or not healthy. It just becomes a great distraction. Aristotle is wisely advising us to avoid the error that we see in modern science and in modern society. He says, quote, "Neither must the cause be required similarly in all things, but in some, as for instance concerning principles. It's sufficient to have shown properly that they are." So here we have another point of methodology. We should not demand the same kind of explanation for all things. For some things, and he mentions principles, it's sufficient to show that they are, to simply show the principle. We do not need to prove the principle or explain why it's so. Why? Because principles are the starting points of our explanation. And what we also need to do is not attempt to explain things or reason with people who don't already share common principles with us. If someone doesn't share our principles, they don't share our common knowledge. Remember that the process of learning begins with common knowledge and then leads to what is not known to us. We can't lead a person by means of reasoning if we don't share the same common knowledge. So if the principles that we're going to take for granted are not granted by other people, it may not be possible for us to prove those principles in the current study because they're proven in a different study. So we've got to be careful that our expectations, again, with respect to causes and explanations, be limited to what's reasonable in a given subject. We don't prove the principles of a science as we study that science. We don't need to explain why the principles are, only identify the principles. The principles are the starting points of our arguments or reasons or explanations. We can't explain everything because that would lead to an infinite regress in the studies. We'd have to explain every principle going all the way back to the first principles. We can only show that this principle is necessary for rational thought on this subject. Once we've established that it is a principle, we don't need to explain why it's true in the present science. Aristotle says, quote, "The subsistence of a thing is the first thing and the principle." The subsistence of a thing is the first thing and a principle. He says that the existence or subsistence, those two words mean the same thing. The existence or subsistence of a thing is the first thing and the first principle. So before we can ask what something is or why it is, we first have to establish that it in fact is, that it exists. That's a fundamental principle in Aristotelian philosophy. Existence comes first. Once we establish existence, then we can ask about the nature and causes of what exists. Aristotle continues and says, quote, "Of principles, however, some are surveyed by induction, others by sense, others from a certain custom, and others in a different way." So where do these principles come from that we use when we explain things or reason? He says that there are a number of different ways by which we arrive at these principles. He says some are discovered through induction. That means observing individual cases and drawing general conclusions. This is what we do in modern science, or what we're supposed to do through the scientific method. We're supposed to observe individuals and, if the evidence allows, draw general conclusions based on those observations. That's called induction. Some principles are known by induction. Some principles are known by direct observation of the senses. We simply see that a thing is so, common sense. Some come from custom or tradition. And note that Aristotle respects custom and tradition as a source of principles. Francis Bacon, when he wrote the Novum Organum, rejected this idea. He argued that custom or tradition should never be allowed to be a source of principles, but that everything should be studied directly by means of induction or observation. That is what I would argue is the fundamental error of modern science. Custom and tradition often have reasons that we're ignorant of, and they shouldn't be despised or rejected. Principles may be drawn from custom or tradition. This is central to Catholic theology, for example, where we have this notion of apostolic succession and authority in the magisterium, which provides us with principles on which all Catholic interpretation is based. That's sound according to Aristotelian philosophy, but it's rejected by modern secular scientific theory. I would argue that the modern secular scientific method is actually what's in error. And he says others are known in other ways. So there's other ways we also collect these principles. Aristotle goes on and says, we should endeavor to discuss everything so far as its nature permits, and we should earnestly apply ourselves to define well, for this is of great importance with respect to what is consequent. We should endeavor to discuss everything as far as its nature permits. We should apply ourselves to define well, for this is of great importance with respect to what is consequent. So Aristotle urges us to discuss everything in a way that's appropriate for the nature of the subject. We should try to define things well, because good definitions are crucial for any reasoning to follow. So we've got to exert ourselves and give attention to define things carefully, and we're going to see him do that in the Ethics. If we get the definitions right at the beginning, everything else that follows can be built on a clear and solid foundation. So we've got to be careful to define terms, to avoid any possible confusion or false reasoning that may be caused by faulty definitions. And this is why we see an example of this in this chapter. We've seen Aristotle spend so much time and make so much effort to at least describe, if not define, what happiness is. He knows that everything that's going to follow in our study of ethics is going to depend on whether we have a correct understanding of what happiness is. And that's not only taught to us as an important part of our method, but it's modeled for us by the way that Aristotle himself teaches. He says, quote, "The principle, therefore, appears to be more than half of the whole." That's where this quote that I gave comes from. "The principle, or the beginning, appears to be more than half of the whole, and many of the things which are objects of inquiry become manifest through it." So Aristotle concludes here this chapter with a powerful statement. The principle or beginning is more than half of the whole. In other words, if we get the starting point right, we've accomplished more than half of the work. Once you have the right beginning, once you have the right principle or foundation, everything else is easy to put together. It's easy to fill in the details. And this is true of any field of study. In mathematics, if you learn, as we do in geometry, the definitions and axioms and postulates, you get all of that principle established first, all of the propositions are relatively easy. And likewise, in ethics, if we understand clearly what happiness is, then the ethical lessons that follow will be easy to understand and order according to that principle, the definition of human happiness. So that's why Aristotle has devoted so much effort to establishing a good definition of happiness. He knows that this is laying the foundation on which the entire system of moral philosophy or ethics is going to be built. And that brings us to the end of chapter 7. Now, before we wrap up, I'll give you some points worth memorizing. I'll give you 12 points for memorization that will serve as a good summary of the most important points in the lesson, and like I said, that are worthy of committing to memory. I'll read these quickly to save some time. You can always back up and re-listen if you want to write them down. Number 1, every art and action has a specific end or goal toward which it is directed. I should clarify that actually. Every human art and action has a specific end or goal toward which it is directed. Number 2, the ultimate human good must be something chosen for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. Number 3, happiness is the ultimate human good because we always choose it for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. Number 4, happiness must be self-sufficient containing everything needed to make life worth living. Number 5, man is naturally a political animal, so happiness includes having friends, family, and a place in community. Number 6, the human function is the activity of the soul in accordance with reason. The human function is the activity of the soul in accordance with reason. Number 7, human excellence and happiness consist in performing the human function well. Number 8, happiness is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, not merely having virtue as a capacity. It's the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Number 9, happiness requires a complete life of virtuous activity, not just a moment or a short time, not a random good day. Happiness requires a complete life of virtuous activity. Number 10, we should investigate each subject with the level of precision appropriate to that subject. Number 11, getting the principles or beginning right is more than half the work of understanding anything. And number 12, the human function is unique to humans and distinguishes us from any other living being, from plants, animals, and so on. So, in this lesson, we've studied Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 7. We've discussed the nature of the human good. We've talked about the definition of happiness as the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. We've talked about the function of man as the exercise of reason. We've talked about the role of virtue in achieving happiness and the importance of getting our principles right in any investigation. We also learned about Aristotle's methodological approach to ethics, the way he's going to investigate this subject, and why we should adjust our expectations for precision according to the subject matter. So now, having gone through all of that, having gone through the division, the interpretation, providing some points for memory, it's time for you as a student to do your job. It's time for you to reread and study this lesson, Chapter 7, for yourself and develop your understanding of the lesson and demonstrate your understanding by completing the assessments in the course activities. If you have any questions or need any help, I'm always available. You can get in touch with me anytime. Email is best. Once again, my name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I hope that this lesson has been helpful. God bless your studies.